9 feet of natural armor swept toward her in a killing arc, and Mira Castellan simply wasn't there anymore, gone low, under the strike, her sword already rising before the giant's arm had finished its swing. The cadet at the rail forgot to breathe. 20 minutes earlier, none of this had seemed possible. He'd watched her walk into Zone 12 that morning, small among giants, a leather-sheathed blade riding her hip, while 70 species worth of cutting-edge hardware gleamed around her. His study partner, Craig, all Voron scale and swagger, had laughed loud enough for the whole observation deck to hear. Someone forgot to tell the primitive that we evolved past sharp sticks. Then the first trial began, and 3 trained candidates went down in under a minute. A drone split clean in half, a Zenthar dropped by a pummel strike to the helmet, a Fisk scout disarmed with her own throat under the blade's edge before she understood she'd already lost. The cadet reviewed the footage twice afterward and still couldn't explain how her timing through a live energy net had been accurate to a tenth of a second. Officials swarmed her, certain the sword hid some illegal system. They scanned it down to the atom and found nothing. 400 years of folded carbon steel. No power cell, no circuitry, no reason at all for what it had just done. Trial 2 should have broken her. Someone in administration stacked 4 senior fighters into her zone instead of the usual 2, hoping to watch the human unravel in public. A blade master, a tactician, a human veteran built like a wall, a berserker who'd ended a dozen careers legally and without mercy. She put all 4 down inside 4 minutes without taking more than a bruise, closing distance on a man outweighing her by hundreds of pounds, and simply redirecting him, the way water finds the gap in a dam instead of fighting the stone. When it ended, she bowed to each of them in turn. Not one looked insulted by it. That was when the officials dragged the sword back to the inspection chamber, certain a harsher scan would finally catch her cheating, and the cadet followed, close enough to hear it all. Chief Technician Verl ran the deep analysis twice, and twice the number on the display refused to change. 412 years, he said quietly, as if the figure itself embarrassed him. No enhancement technology of any kind. Administrator Quelks, who'd spent 20 minutes demanding disqualification, flushed a furious orange. Then how does it cut through Durasteel? It was an old Corian scholar who finally answered, stepping to the table without touching the blade, studying it the way a man studies something he fears won't be here tomorrow. A katana, he said. Human feudal work. The forging isn't only heat and folding, there's intention hammered into the metal itself. Quelks scoffed at the word. The scholar didn't blink. Every species in this hall builds weapons that answer to a nervous system or a heartbeat, and we call that engineering. Ask yourself what 16 generations of hands, 16 generations of care, might build without a single circuit. Mira, seated on a bench with a water pouch, hadn't looked proud. She'd looked almost embarrassed. My uncle always said the steel keeps every hand that's held it, she offered. Said I'd know what he meant once I was ready. And are you ready? The scholar asked. I'm standing here, aren't I? Quelks wasn't satisfied. He couldn't disqualify a candidate who had broken no rule, so he built a third trial meant to do what the first 2 hadn't, single combat. A 10-minute window, 1 clean hit to win, against Battlemaster Corvin. 7 years undefeated, a Threxian juggernaut of natural plating and 4 arms, 40 years without a single fighter finding a gap in his guard. It wasn't a test. It was a door built to swing shut. Which is where the story had opened, the cadet at the rail, Mira dropping under that first killing sweep, her blade rising behind Corvin before his stance had even reset. The tap of steel against his back plate rang through the arena's sensors. Point. Corvin turned, all 6 eyes wide. That was extremely good, he rumbled. Shall we continue? She reset her stance. Please. He came at her with everything then, 40 years of technique thrown behind 4 arms moving in patterns that shouldn't have been trackable. She didn't dodge so much as dissolve, redirecting each strike a fraction past where it needed to land, and every time he thought he'd boxed her in, she was already somewhere else. 2 minutes in, he abandoned offense and folded into a defensive shell instead, plates overlapping 7 deep, betting patience alone would beat a first-year candidate before her legs gave out. Mira went still, sword extended, point aimed at his skull, and she breathed once, twice, like she was listening for something underneath the noise of the crowd. "What is she doing?" Quelks demanded from the box, and nobody answered because the cadet felt it before he understood it. A change in the air, pressure before a storm breaks, and then she moved, not fast, not violent, just certain, and the blade found an angle through Corvin's overlapping plates that had no business existing. It touched skin beneath 7 layers of natural armor. The censor screamed, "Point to Castellan." Corvin looked down at the sword resting against his own chest and didn't move for a long moment. "No one has ever put a blade there," he said finally. "4 decades of fighting, and no one has ever found that seam." "My uncle used to say every guard has a seam somewhere," Mira answered, drawing the blade back. "You just have to stop looking for it with your eyes and start trusting the sword to find it for you." Corvin bowed, the full, formal bow his people reserved for equals. "I concede. The trial is finished." For 3 heartbeats, the arena said nothing. Then someone began clapping, and it spread like fire finding dry grass. And this was the moment the cadet would remember longest, louder even than the strike itself, the sound of an entire academy changing its mind at once. Quelks tried one last time. Performance this unprecedented requires further review before formal admission can be. "Enough of that." The voice came from the entrance, heavy footsteps behind it, an older human, grey at the temples, scarred along both forearms, carrying himself like a soldier who had never fully retired. He crossed straight to Mira and folded her into a hug she returned without hesitation. "Uncle Thomas." The cadet watched her calm mask crack into something warmer than anything she'd shown all day. Thomas turned on the administrators without releasing his niece's shoulder. "Commander Castellan, Earth Defense, retired. That's my niece, and the sword is family property, 16 generations of it. She cleared your trials clean. So somebody tell me why she's standing here instead of holding her admission papers." "There are protocols," Quelk started, "for candidates whose capabilities fall outside." "Say what you mean," Thomas cut in, voice gone level and hard. "You built a whole doctrine on newer always beating older, and one girl with a blade your grandparents would recognize just tore that doctrine apart in front of everyone who matters. You threw 4 seniors at her. You threw your undefeated champion at her with a clock running. She beat both, and you're calling that a problem instead of an answer you don't like." Silence held the arena. Quelks's face cycled through 3 colors before settling on something like surrender. The old scholar broke it himself. "I move to admit candidate Castellan immediately on the strength of everything we witnessed today." Hands rose across the observation levels, claws, tentacles, even 2 of Corvin's massive arms lifted in agreement. The vote wasn't close. "Motion carried," the overseer announced, and the cheer that followed was louder than anything the trials themselves had produced. Much later, once the crowd had thinned and the officials had gone off to argue somewhere out of earshot, the cadet stayed at the rail. Craig stood beside him, unusually quiet, watching Mira and her uncle talk low near the arena floor, the sword sheathed now, silent. "You know what stays with me," Craig said at last. "She never once looked like she was fighting at her limit. That whole match, that was her being polite." The cadet didn't answer right away. He looked instead at the weapon on his own hip, standard issue, forged in a factory alongside 10,000 others, indistinguishable from any blade in the fleet. He rested 2 fingers against the hilt the way she'd rested hers on Whisper's pummel, and stood there a while longer, wondering for the first time in his life what a sword with no history at all could possibly have to remember.